PowerPlayChess, brought to you in association with Kagi. I thought the most interesting encounter from Norway Chess Round 7 was Fabiano Caruana against Alireza Firouzja. This was a really tense gioco piano with piece sacrifices, pawn sacrifices, really dramatic stuff. Let's take a look. So standard gioco piano, and there are so many ways for white to play this. You have to kind of feel your way through this opening. If you remember, Carlsen rather enjoyed playing this early bishop g5. I've looked at quite a lot of those games on the channel. Really interesting when there's this pin that tempts black forward with h6 and g5. You know, trying to provoke a weakness. And Caruana did something similar, but watch how he got there. So first of all, the early development of the knight. Notice he hasn't yet castled. a6, that gives the bishop a safe square here. And now instead of castling, knight f1. So the knight transfers to the king side very quickly. Means you don't have to play rook e1 and then knight f1. Castles. And bishop g5 is possible here, actually. That's quite interesting because the knight still has the option to go to e3 and the bishop can come back here. But knight g3 played instead. Okay, pretty normal. And the bishop drops back to a7. Now, you know, if white wanted to play something normal, then you could prevent knight a5, which bags that bishop. You could play, for example, a4 or bishop b3. These are all normal moves. And then you can always come back to castling and so on. Very standard position. But here Caruana played something really unusual and very daring. He now played bishop g5. Well, we like the pin. This is nice. And white threatens to play knight h5, damaging those pawns because of the pressure here. But the difference to the other positions we looked at is that here there's no retreat for the bishop to g3. So basically, if black plays g5, then white has to sacrifice a piece. Now, you could say the knight is very well placed for that. So, for example, if g5 straight away, then this pin is actually fatal. You know, there's knight h5 is coming to put pressure here. But, of course, black can just keep this one in mind. So, first of all, Firouzja played g6. Really interesting. So he's just making room for his king, and then he'll bring the rook across, basically. So a4 from Caruana. So he wants to preserve that bishop if it's attacked. King g7. And now Caruana castles. And g5. Here we go. So that now that the king is better placed, now that the rook can come across to stop knight h5, then this is possible. So let's take a look. So, I mean, clearly Caruana had intended this. You know, after you play knight g3 and then bishop g5, there's no way back for white. So the threat is knight h5. So therefore, rook h8. Well, it doesn't quite prevent it, but discourages that. So, for example, after this, that can be taken. And this, and well, black should be better in this position because, you know, basically white has run out of attacking pieces. You could go bishop e6. You could play bishop d7, and the rook comes over. Black must be better here. I mean, that's a wonderful piece on a7. Looks fantastic for black. H4 feels like the right move here to support that bishop. And after this, I think I mean, this is just incredibly messy. Very hard to give an assessment of this position. I mean, well, a computer will give an instant assessment, but in a human game, really tough for both sides, actually. But Caruana played h3, and that was just too modest. I understand what he's trying to do. He was trying to keep control of that square because he's worried about a piece landing there. But black just looks better now. Now, Firouzja put the knight back on e8, so he's got out of the pin. I have to say, knight h7 feels just more natural to me. And then just slipping out of the way with the king. And that knight could well end up on g5, and you never know. Might be able to sacrifice itself here. In any case, I think black is taking control. Maybe this queen just steps up the board. I think the king is going to be pretty safe on e7. So that was rather surprising that he came back to e8. Because it does, after all, it blocks the 8th rank. Bishop e3 played. Now, I don't think black wants to take here with attack on the f-file. So king f8 looks normal, also opens the file for the queen. Exchange on a7. And queen e3. So Caruana wants to get in f4. This rook looks a bit funny on a7. But it is protected. It's going to take one move to bring it back into play. But yeah, I mean, obviously white has compensation here. 2 pawns for the piece, and f4 is coming. Queen g7 played, which is very reasonable. The computer likes knight f6, and then bishop h3. But I mean, this involves some crazy computer lines after this. I mean, all hell breaks loose. I mean, I'm not surprised Firouzja declined to go in for that. He just did something sensible. Queen g7. This is pragmatic chess. He's realised that after f4 he can play queen h6, which just slows white down. There's a nice pin here, but also the queen is well placed on h6. There's potential to sacrifice here. Rook f3. Yeah, so that protects the queen and also prepares for rook number 2 to come across. Knight f6. Rook f1. So Caruana is stabilising here. This is quite a significant force on the f-file. But that's a good move. Bishop g4. Of course, if that's taken, then something disastrous happens down here. Probably just knight takes, threatens the queen and threatens a mate. So the rook has to go back. Well, actually, it doesn't have to go back. That's what Caruana played. In fact, would have been better to take here. Again, this is incredibly hard to analyse. The computer likes this for white, or thinks this is playable for white. In any case, it would lead to simplification. So it's, let me see, basically knight and 2 pawns, if I can count. Yeah, knight and 2 pawns against a rook. Should be about level. But rook f2 played. And again, the computer thinks that black has the advantage here if black plays rook g8. Just holding that bishop there, and because the pawn has advanced, then the squares along the g-file are a little bit weak. But very hard to play a move like that, keeping the tension. Instead, Firouzja decided to simplify the position with knight h5. Very understandable. Just clarifying things. And the rook came back. Queen g3. So finally the queen steps out of the line of black's queen, and white is ready to take here. But Firouzja decides, okay, I need to just get those queens off. I mean, queen e3 is possible. We could be heading for a draw after queen h6, actually. But Caruana decided, okay, I've had enough of these adventures. And he took on e5, and he's going to get a third pawn. So he's playing quite safely, actually. So if knight takes, then d4, and this one is going to fall. So pawn takes and bishop takes f7. So now Caruana has 3 pawns for the piece. Knight against 3 pawns. Rook f8. Yeah. The rook comes across, prevents an incursion. So finally that rook joins in the game. Interesting moment, actually. How do you play here with white? Yeah, time for you to have a little think. Time for me to have a little drink. Cheers, everyone. Quick slurp of tea. White play. I think Caruana makes an excellent practical decision here, actually. This one's attacked, so you have a fundamental decision. Do you exchange bishops, or do you retreat the bishop somewhere on this diagonal? Caruana played bishop d5, which I think is a good decision. I was looking at bishop takes h5 and wondering, well, maybe it's possible to advance these pawns supported by the king. Now, that would be very nice if you get them far up the board, but watch what can happen potentially. Rook h6, I think this is a nice maneuver. This knight is very poorly placed. So we have to think, where do we want that piece? Well, we can bounce around. So while white is just stepping gently up the board, this rook activates to attack this. It's defended, and now knight e6. Yes, white still has 3 pawns, but there's potential for that knight hop in here. These pawns, well, they're still not so far up the board. If black can take a pawn here, then he could be actually winning. And this is a tricky position for white, I think. So I think Caruana made a good decision there to keep this bishop. Exchange of rooks and bishop g6. Okay, so that just discourages white from advancing the g-pawn. Rook f3. So potentially guarding this one in order to play g4, but also allowing the king to the middle of the board. That's very important. You know, this is potentially a weak pawn. So the king rushes into the middle. As usual, that's what we should be doing, centralizing the king in the endgame, just to make sure everything's supported. So Caruana not making any committal pawn moves, just solidifying his position. And this knight hops round to c5, an exchange, and the rook comes back. So that rook would very much like to enter into the position, but black gets there first. d4. Right, supported by the king. The pawn advances. And g4. Finally, it's time to get going once everything is nice and solid. Attacks that one, slows them down. And the knight hops in. This is still tricky. So that's blocked out. An exchange and rook e8. So there's pressure on this pawn, and potentially the knight can hop into d5. So this could be tricky. So Caruana steps out of the line of the rook. There's a check, and the king came back. Okay, I think we know the end of this story. Firouzja did not take. I think he's absolutely right not to, because then the king can just edge up the board, supporting all the pawns, and that's difficult for black. But instead, rook e8, position repeats, and 3-4 repetition, and that is a draw. Thought really tense game actually. You know, there were moments when Firouzja could have risked more. The computer likes black's position, but these kind of moves, for example here, like knight f6, very, very difficult to analyse. And Firouzja made the pragmatic choice and went for queen g7 to bring the queen to h6 to offer exchanges. It's a very human way of playing. So they went into an Armageddon. Just very quickly, I don't want to spend too much time on this. It was, after all, 74 moves. It was another gioco piano, but Caruana played in a more orthodox way, like this, pretty standard. But later on, I mean, basically in this position, I don't think white has any advantage whatsoever. But it's very interesting. Look at this structure with these double D pawns. Does this remind you of anything? If I just go forward a little bit, Firouzja with black I think is doing very nicely here. So which game is this similar to? Well, you might recall the game between Vidit and Gukesh. Just look at this structure. Look at black's rook controlling the A file. Okay, I'm just going to remind you of that Vidit Gukesh game. And let's just come back to this position. Look, double D pawns, very static, potentially weak, and that rook controlling the open file. Look at the second rank, very weak. Look at the third rank, very weak. We need that pawn on f2 to cover the second rank. And the same happened in this game. I think, you know, by the time they've got to this position, I think Firouzja with black has a very clear advantage. Remember, this is an Armageddon game. Firouzja with black only needed a draw. But to generate winning chances here for white, incredibly difficult. These pawns are so static because whenever the D pawn moves, it just weakens e4. And they can be attacked from the side. So basically Firouzja had no difficulties in this position and actually just played for a draw. Yeah, he was better for most of this game actually. And let me see if we get to roughly this position. Well, Firouzja was just going back and forth with his king and just keeping ahead on time. He could just win with knight e5. He wasn't looking for a win. He was just making sure he was ahead on the clock, basically. But knight e5 is a pretty simple winning move. Queen a1. The pin doesn't have any effect. If this is taken, then in a couple of moves that's going through, or knight takes, queen takes, completely winning position. And that's Zugzwang, actually. And that forces a win. But no, Firouzja was just looking for a draw, and the game ended like this. And very shortly, a perpetual and just a draw. So Firouzja picked up the extra half point by holding out in that Armageddon. Anyway, I thought they were very intriguing games, and yeah, just worth remembering. It can look a bit flashy to play bishop e3 and then to recapture with the f pawn, because you think, oh, there could be chances on the f file. Long term, this can be dodgy. Oh yeah, of course, Caruana lost against Carlsen with this similar structure as well. I feel it's just a bit too static if you don't get some nice attack on the king side. There we go. Thanks for watching.